Janitors, billions. The untold story of how America's invisible workers, the people who cleaned offices, mopped floors, and emptied trash cans, quietly accumulated more wealth than Harvard MBAs, outperformed Wall Street, died leaving fortunes worth $8 million, $9 million, $4 million that shocked entire communities and proved that the path to wealth isn't found in Ivy League schools or corner offices, but in the basements and back hallways where nobody was watching. On February 8, 2015, when lawyers opened the estate of Ronald James Redd, a 92-year-old man who had died 7 months earlier in Brattleboro, Vermont, they expected to find maybe $100,000 in savings, maybe a modest life insurance policy, maybe some Social Security benefits that would cover his funeral expenses and leave a little something for his stepchildren, because Ronald Redd had spent his entire adult life working jobs that most people consider dead-end. He was a gas station attendant for 25 years, then worked part-time as a janitor at J.C. Penney for another 17 years until 1997. He drove a second-hand Toyota Yaris that was so old it was falling apart. He wore clothes held together with safety pins because he was too frugal to buy new ones. He cut his own firewood well into his 90s. He lived in a modest house, ate breakfast every morning at the hospital cafeteria where he ordered the same thing every day: an English muffin with peanut butter and coffee, and nobody, not his stepchildren, not his friends, not his neighbors, not the bank tellers who saw him regularly, not the lawyers who would eventually handle his estate. Nobody had any idea that Ronald Reed was sitting on a fortune, and when the lawyers opened his portfolio, when they saw the numbers, when they counted up the stocks and the bonds and the accumulation of decades of patient compounding, the total came to $8 million. $8 million from a man who never earned more than maybe $40,000 a year in his best years as a janitor, who spent most of his life making far less, and the lawyers were stunned. The family was tremendously surprised. The entire town of Brattleboro was shocked when the news broke that their frugal elderly neighbor, who everyone thought was just scraping by, had left $4.8 million to the local hospital and $1.2 million to the local library. And this story, this revelation that a janitor had accumulated more wealth than most doctors and lawyers and investment bankers, went viral, made national news, appeared in the Wall Street Journal and Forbes and CNBC. But what most people don't realize, what the media coverage largely missed, is that Ronald Reed wasn't unique, wasn't some once-in-a-generation anomaly. He was part of a quiet army of blue-collar millionaires, secretaries and janitors and librarians and parking attendants and gas station workers who had been doing the same thing for decades, spending less than they earned, investing the difference in simple stocks, holding for 40 or 50 or 60 years, never selling, never panicking, never trying to get rich quick, just patiently compounding wealth while everyone around them was chasing status and consumption and keeping up with the Joneses. And collectively, these invisible workers, these people that society dismissed as unambitious or unsuccessful, had accumulated billions of dollars in wealth, had outperformed virtually every professional money manager and hedge fund, had built fortunes that would shock their communities when they eventually died and their wills were read, and in doing so they proved something profound and uncomfortable about American capitalism, which is that wealth accumulation has almost nothing to do with how much you earn or what credentials you have or how smart you are, and everything to do with behavior, with consistency, with patience, with the ability to resist cultural pressure to spend and consume, and that the people best positioned to build wealth aren't the high earners in high-status jobs, but the low-profile workers in low-status jobs who nobody expects to succeed and who therefore face no social pressure to display success through consumption. Let me tell you about the others, because Ronald Reed is just the beginning of this story. Just the most famous case, and understanding the full phenomenon requires seeing the pattern, requires recognizing that what Reed did has been replicated dozens if not hundreds of times by people in similar circumstances. Start with Sylvia Bloom, who worked for 67 years as a legal secretary at a law firm in Manhattan, Cleary Gottlieb Steen in Hamilton, one of the most prestigious firms in New York. And Sylvia made a secretary's salary, which was decent but nothing special, maybe $40,000 to $60,000 in her later years, and she lived in Brooklyn in a modest apartment, took the subway to work, lived simply, and nobody at the firm thought she was anything special. She was just Sylvia, reliable, quiet, competent, the kind of employee who does her job well but doesn't draw attention. And when Sylvia died in 2016 at age 96, she left an estate worth $9.2 million, $9.2 million, more than most of the lawyers she worked for had accumulated. And the way she built this fortune is revealing. Sylvia had a system. When the lawyers she worked for would tell her to buy stocks for their personal accounts, she would buy small positions in the same stocks for her own account. She was essentially copying the investment decisions of wealthy lawyers who had teams of advisors, but she was doing it with her secretary's salary, buying maybe $500 or $1,000 worth when the lawyer bought $50,000 worth. And she did this for 67 years, never sold, just kept accumulating, kept reinvesting dividends, kept buying more shares whenever she had extra money. And when she died, she left the entire fortune to charity, to scholarships for underprivileged students, and to Henry Street Settlement, which provides social services in the Lower East Side. Or consider Robert Morin, who worked for 50 years as a librarian at the University of New Hampshire, drove a 1992 Plymouth, lived in a mobile home, ate at the library cafeteria to save money, wore the same ratty clothes for years, and when he died in 2015 nobody expected anything special. But his estate was worth $4 million, and he left almost all of it to the university to build a new career center for students. And Morin had accumulated this wealth through a combination of savings, frugal living, and smart investing. He put most of his earnings into bank accounts and investments and life insurance policies, and he just let it compound for 5 decades, never touched it, never spent it, lived as if he had nothing, and died leaving a legacy that would help thousands of students. Or take Doris Schwartz, a former flight attendant and teacher who lived so frugally that friends said she survived on peanut butter and ice cream. But when Doris died at age 93 in 2013, she left $3.4 million to a local community foundation to help teachers and students, and while working as a flight attendant she had made diverse investments around the world, had taken advantage of her travel to learn about different markets and companies, and had built a fortune that nobody suspected existed. Or look at Grace Groner, a secretary at Abbott Laboratories who bought 3 shares of Abbott stock in 1935 for $180, held them for 75 years, reinvested all dividends, never sold a single share, and when she died in 2010 those 3 shares had become 100,000 shares worth $7 million. $7 million from a $180 investment and 75 years of patience. The pattern here is unmistakable. These are not high earners, not people with business degrees or financial expertise, not people with access to private equity or hedge funds or sophisticated investment strategies. These are secretaries making $40,000 a year, janitors making $30,000, librarians making $50,000, flight attendants making $45,000, ordinary working-class people with ordinary jobs and ordinary salaries. But they all did the same things. They spent less than they earned. They invested. The difference systematically. They bought simple stocks in good companies. They held for decades without selling. They reinvested dividends. They ignored market crashes and bubbles and panic. They lived frugally by choice, not by necessity. They resisted the cultural pressure to signal success through consumption. And they compounded wealth patiently over 40 or 50 or 60 years. And the results were extraordinary: fortunes of $3 million, $4 million, $7 million, $8 million, $9 million, amounts that most doctors and lawyers and executives never accumulate despite earning far more. Amounts that represent generational wealth, life-changing money, fuck you money. And these janitors and secretaries built these fortunes while working jobs that society considers menial, while being invisible to the people around them, while having no status or prestige or recognition. And that invisibility, that low status, that lack of expectation, that's actually what made it possible. Because here's what nobody talks about when they discuss these stories. Here's the uncomfortable truth that challenges our assumptions about success and wealth and the American dream. The high-status, high-earning professionals, the doctors and lawyers and investment bankers and consultants, they actually face enormous obstacles to wealth accumulation that low-status, low-earning workers don't face. And those obstacles are almost entirely behavioral and social. Start with lifestyle inflation. When you're a doctor earning $300,000 a year, you're expected to live like a doctor. You're expected to have a nice house in a nice neighborhood, drive a nice car, wear nice clothes, take nice vacations, send your kids to nice schools, and these expectations come from your peers, from your spouse, from your parents, from society's image of what successful people look like. And if you violate these expectations, if you try to live like a janitor while earning like a doctor, you face social sanctions. People think there's something wrong with you, your spouse might leave you, your kids might resent you, your colleagues might look down on you, so most high earners conform. They adopt the consumption patterns expected of their income level, and once you're spending $250,000 a year maintaining a lifestyle, you only have $50,000 left to save even though you're earning $300,000. Whereas the janitor earning $30,000 who lives on $20,000 has $10,000 to save. Proportionally, the janitor is saving more, and over decades this difference compounds dramatically. And it's not just lifestyle inflation, it's also financial sophistication or the illusion of financial sophistication, because doctors and lawyers and executives think they're smart, think they understand investing, think they can pick stocks or time markets or find the next Amazon. And this confidence leads them to trade actively, to chase returns, to pay fees to advisors and hedge funds, to make complicated investment decisions that usually backfire, whereas the janitor knows he doesn't understand finance, knows he's not smart enough to beat the market, and so he does the simplest possible thing, buys a few blue-chip stocks like Johnson & Johnson and Procter & Gamble and General Electric, holds them forever, reinvests dividends, and that's it. No trading, no fees, no complexity, just buy good companies and hold. And counterintuitively, this simplicity, this admission of ignorance, this avoidance of sophistication produces better results than the active trading and fee paying and complexity that educated high earners engage in. Ronald Read owned stock in 95 companies when he died, mostly big stable companies that paid dividends. He held some of these stocks for 40 or 50 years, and the Wall Street Journal analyzed his portfolio and concluded that he was a good stock picker and displayed remarkable frugality and patience. But the truth is, Read probably wasn't a good stock picker in the sense of having special insight. He just bought companies that everyone had heard of and held them forever, and that strategy, that boring, obvious strategy that any idiot could execute, beat the sophisticated strategies that professional managers with MBAs and Bloomberg terminals were using. Now let's talk about the math, because understanding how janitors accumulate millions requires understanding compound interest, and most people don't intuitively grasp how powerful compounding is over long time horizons. Ronald Read worked from 1945 when he was discharged from World War II until 1997 when he retired from J.C. Penney, giving him a 52-year investing career. Let's assume he started with nothing in 1945 and invested equal amounts monthly into stocks that performed like the S&P 500 average, which returned about 10% annually including dividends over that period, to reach $8 million by 2014 when he died 69 years after he started investing. Read would have needed to invest approximately $300 per month in inflation-adjusted dollars, which sounds like a lot, but remember that's adjusted in 1945 dollars. It would have been maybe $30 to $40 per month, by the 1970s maybe $100 per month, by the 1990s maybe $200 to $300 per month. Entirely feasible for someone making $30,000 to $40,000 per year who lives frugally. The magic isn't in the monthly amount, the magic is in the time. 69 years of compounding, 69 years of reinvesting dividends, 69 years of not selling, not panicking, not trying to time the market, just consistently putting money into stocks and leaving it alone, and time does all the work. In the first 10 years his portfolio might have grown to $50,000, after 20 years maybe $250,000, after 30 years maybe $800,000, after 40 years maybe $2 million, after 50 years maybe $5 million, And in the final 19 years from when he retired until he died, watching but not touching, the portfolio grows from maybe $3 to $4 million to $8 million, and he doesn't do anything in these final years except not sell, and not selling, having the discipline to not touch the money, is actually the hardest part, is what separates the janitors who die with millions from the executives who die broke. And here's what's profound about this. Here's why these stories matter beyond just being feel-good tales about humble people succeeding. What janitors like Ronald Read proved is that investment performance and wealth accumulation are almost entirely divorced from intelligence, education, income, and status, that the factors that predict wealth-building success are behavioral, not intellectual, and the key behaviors are spending less than you earn, investing systematically regardless of market conditions, avoiding debt, minimizing fees, holding for decades without selling, and resisting cultural pressure to consume. And these are behaviors that anyone can execute regardless of IQ or education or income level. A janitor can do these things as easily as a doctor, maybe more easily because the janitor faces less social pressure to display success. And this means the traditional hierarchy of success and prestige that American society operates under is basically inverted when it comes to wealth accumulation. The people at the top, the prestigious, well-educated high earners, they often accumulate less wealth than people at the bottom, the modest low-status workers who nobody expects to succeed. And this inversion is uncomfortable, challenges our meritocratic myths, suggests that maybe intelligence and credentials aren't as valuable as we think, or at least aren't valuable in the ways we assume. But there's a darker side to these stories that doesn't get discussed much, which is opportunity cost and the value of life, because yes, Ronald Read died with $8 million, but he also died having never traveled, never eaten at nice restaurants, never owned new clothes, never drove a new car, never experienced luxury or comfort. He spent 92 years living like he was poor even after he became a multimillionaire. And the question nobody asks is, was it worth it? Did Ronald Read win at life by accumulating $8 million that he never spent and couldn't take with him? Or did he lose by denying himself decades of experiences and pleasures that he could have afforded? Barry Ritholtz of the Washington Post raised this question, praised Read's wealth accumulation, but also noted, there is a cautionary tale about recognizing the value of your finite time here on Earth. Perhaps learning to enjoy life while you can is part of that equation. And this tension between accumulation and consumption, between delayed gratification and present enjoyment, between dying rich and living rich, is something each person has to resolve for themselves. And there's no objectively correct answer. Read apparently found satisfaction in the process of accumulating, in seeing his portfolio grow, in the security and pride of having wealth, and chose to give it all to charity rather than to spend it on himself or leave it to family. And maybe for him that was fulfilling, maybe that was his version of winning, but it's worth acknowledging that there's a cost to extreme frugality, that wealth that's never spent is in some sense wasted, that the point of money is ultimately to be converted into experiences or security or legacy, not just to exist as numbers in an account. The reaction to Ronald Read's story when it broke in 2015 was fascinating and revealing. Financial media celebrated it as proof that anyone can become a millionaire, that the American dream is alive, that hard work and discipline and patience pay off. Morgan Housel included Read's story in his best-selling book, The Psychology of Money, using it to illustrate the power of long-term investing and frugal living. Personal finance blogs and YouTube channels used Read as an example of what's possible when you follow simple rules and stick to them for decades. But there was also criticism. Some people argued that Read's extreme frugality was pathological, that he had some kind of hoarding disorder or trauma from growing up during the Depression, that his refusal to spend money even on basic comforts wasn't admirable but sad, that he sacrificed quality of life for no good reason since he didn't have children to leave money to and apparently didn't enjoy spending it himself, and there's probably truth in both perspectives. Read's accumulation was simultaneously impressive and tragic, admirable and sad, proof of what's possible through discipline and also proof of the costs of taking discipline too far. What's less discussed but equally important is the class dynamics and social invisibility that made Reed's accumulation possible. Because being a janitor meant that nobody expected Ronald Reed to be rich. Nobody expected him to signal success through consumption. Nobody judged him for driving an old car or wearing worn clothes. That was normal for a janitor, expected even. Whereas if Reed had been a doctor or lawyer or executive, if he had earned $300,000 a year instead of $30,000, the same frugal behaviors would have marked him as weird, would have created social friction, would have been much harder to maintain, and this invisibility, this freedom from expectation, is a genuine advantage that low-status workers have over high-status workers when it comes to wealth accumulation. The janitor can live like a janitor regardless of his net worth and nobody thinks twice, but the doctor who lives like a janitor faces constant questions and judgment. And this social dynamic is a huge, but rarely acknowledged factor in wealth accumulation, much more important than income in many cases. And here's where it gets really interesting, because there's actually a whole genre of these stories, a whole category of secret millionaires who were janitors and secretaries and parking lot attendants and librarians and nurses, people who worked modest jobs, lived frugally, invested simply, and died leaving fortunes that shocked their communities. And while each story is individual, the pattern is remarkably consistent. These people share certain characteristics beyond just frugality and patient investing. They were often single or widowed, which meant they didn't face pressure from spouses to spend more. They were often childless or had stepchildren rather than biological children, which meant they felt less obligation to leave legacies and more freedom to live on their own terms. They were often educated enough to read and understand basic investing, but not educated enough to think they were smarter than the market. They were usually first-generation wealth, came from poor or working-class families, so they had no inherited money but also no family expectations around lifestyle. They were frequently immigrants or children of immigrants who had strong work ethics and high savings rates. They lived in small towns or modest neighborhoods where cost of living was low and consumption signaling was minimal, and they almost always gave away significant portions of their wealth to charity rather than to family, suggesting that wealth accumulation for them was about security and legacy rather than dynasty building. The investment strategies these secret millionaires used were remarkably simple and remarkably similar. Most bought blue-chip dividend-paying stocks. Companies like Johnson & Johnson, Procter & Gamble, ExxonMobil, CVS, General Electric, companies that everyone had heard of and that paid reliable dividends. They held these stocks for decades, often 30 or 40 or 50 years, never sold even during crashes and recessions, reinvested all dividends automatically, never tried to time the market or chase hot stocks, rarely if ever traded, kept costs and fees to an absolute minimum, often held stocks directly rather than through mutual funds to avoid management fees, and they diversified across 20 or 50 or 100 different companies, but not in a sophisticated way, just bought a bit of this and a bit of that whenever they had money to invest. And this strategy, this supremely boring and obvious strategy, consistently produced returns of 8 to 12% annually over multi-decade periods, which is enough to turn $100 per month into several million dollars given enough time. And the key insight is that this strategy requires zero intelligence or expertise, requires no special knowledge or skills, just requires the discipline to execute it consistently for decades. And that discipline, that patience, is something that seems to come more naturally to janitors and secretaries than to MBAs and hedge fund managers. But let's address the skeptical perspective, because some people argue that these stories are cherry-picked, that for every Ronald Reed who accumulated millions there are thousands of janitors who died broke, that survivorship bias makes us focus on the successes and ignore the failures, and this criticism has some merit. Obviously not every janitor becomes a millionaire, most janitors don't accumulate significant wealth, and highlighting the exceptions might create unrealistic expectations. But the counterargument is that the janitors who accumulated millions weren't exceptional in terms of intelligence or luck. They just executed simple behaviors consistently, and those behaviors are replicable. Anyone could do what Ronald Reed did, could save 20 to 30% of income regardless of what that income is, could buy index funds or dividend stocks and hold them for 40 years, could resist lifestyle inflation and consumption signaling. The question isn't whether it's possible, the question is whether people have the discipline and patience and willingness to be unfashionable that these behaviors require. And the evidence suggests that most people don't. Most people prefer present consumption to future wealth, prefer signaling status today to being rich tomorrow, prefer fitting in with their peer group to being an outlier, and that's fine, that's a legitimate choice. But it means that wealth accumulation is more about psychology and behavior than about opportunity or intelligence. The opportunities that Ronald Read accessed were available to everyone. The stocks he bought were publicly traded and well known. The strategy he followed is described in every basic investing book. The difference is that he actually executed the strategy for 69 years while most people quit after a few years or never start at all. The broader lesson from the Janitor Millionaires, the thing that makes these stories important beyond just personal finance, is what they reveal about inequality and class mobility in America. Because one interpretation of these stories is optimistic, is that anyone can become wealthy through discipline and patience, that class origin doesn't determine class destination, that janitors can die richer than doctors, that the American dream is alive. But another interpretation is pessimistic, is that these stories are so rare and surprising precisely because class mobility is actually very limited, that we celebrate janitors who become millionaires because it almost never happens, because the story is so unusual that it's newsworthy, and that the structural barriers to wealth accumulation for working-class people are so high that only the most extraordinary individuals can overcome them. Individuals with monk-like discipline and multi-decade time horizons and willingness to sacrifice present consumption, and expecting ordinary people to replicate these behaviors is unrealistic. And this tension between the optimistic and pessimistic interpretations is unresolved. Both seem partially true. Yes, anyone theoretically can accumulate wealth through simple behaviors, but no, most people won't because the behaviors required are difficult and require sacrificing things that make life enjoyable, and whether that's a personal failure of discipline or a systemic failure of economic structure depends on your political philosophy. What's undeniable is that these stories have captured the American imagination in a way that stories about hedge fund managers or tech entrepreneurs or inherited wealth never do. Because janitors who become millionaires represent a version of success that feels accessible, feels democratic, doesn't require privilege or connections or credentials, just requires doing the obvious boring things that everyone knows they should do but almost nobody actually does. And there's something deeply satisfying about that, about the idea that the person mopping floors at night might die richer than the CEO whose office he's cleaning, that the secretary might outperform the hedge fund that her boss invests in, that intelligence and status and income don't predict wealth as well as patience and frugality do, and whether these stories inspire people to save more or whether they just make people feel good about the possibility of success without actually changing behavior, that's an open question. But the stories persist, get retold, go viral every few years when another secret millionaire is discovered, another modest worker dies and leaves millions to charity, and everyone acts surprised even though the pattern is well established. And maybe that perpetual surprise, that sense that it shouldn't be possible but somehow is, maybe that's the most important thing these stories tell us about wealth and class in America. So here we are in late 2025, more than a decade after Ronald Read died. And his story is still being told, still being used in personal finance discussions, still being shared on social media as motivation, and there are almost certainly dozens or hundreds of secret millionaires alive right now, janitors and secretaries and librarians who have been quietly accumulating wealth for decades, who will die in the next 10 or 20 years and shock their communities with the fortunes they've built. And when those stories break, when the lawyers open those estates, the reaction will be the same: surprise, admiration, inspiration, celebration of the American dream, discussion of financial literacy, debate about whether extreme frugality is admirable or pathological, and then the story will fade and be forgotten until the next one, and the cycle will continue because these stories are too good not to tell, too powerful not to inspire, too uncomfortable not to debate. They challenge our assumptions about who succeeds and why. They prove that the path to wealth isn't what we think it is. They demonstrate that status and credentials and intelligence matter less than discipline and patience. They show that being invisible can be an advantage, that low expectations can be liberating, that simplicity beats sophistication, that time beats timing, that behavior beats brains, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the people cleaning offices and mopping floors and emptying trash cans, the people who society dismisses as unambitious or unsuccessful, those people understand something about wealth accumulation that Harvard MBAs never learn, which is that wealth isn't about how much you earn or how smart you are or what degrees you have. It's about spending less than you earn and investing the difference and waiting and waiting and waiting some more for decades through crashes and bubbles and recessions and booms, never selling, never panicking, never deviating from the simple, boring strategy that everyone knows works but almost nobody has the discipline to execute. And that's the real secret, the secret that janitors know and executives don't, which is that wealth accumulation isn't complicated. It's just really, really hard. Not intellectually hard but behaviorally hard. And the people best equipped to do hard, boring things consistently for decades aren't the people with high IQs or fancy credentials. They're the people who have been doing hard, boring things their entire lives. The janitors and secretaries and librarians who show up and do their work and don't complain and don't quit, who apply that same discipline to their finances, who treat investing like mopping a floor, as something you do regularly and consistently and without emotion. And when you approach wealth that way, when you treat it as a job that requires showing up every day and doing the simple, obvious things without expecting applause or recognition or immediate results, that's when fortunes get built. That's when janitors die leaving $8 million. That's when America's invisible workers turn out to own more of America than anyone suspected.